Welcome to Chills with Chaz. We'll continue the Haunted Heartland series with the stories Old Jacob Cox, The Vigil, and Oscar. Let's get into it. Martin Winding had known the old man who lived by the side of the muddy, rutted road for decades. Everyone in Martin County, Indiana knew Jacob Cox. He was the local character. Winding reined his saddle horse a short distance from the Cox farm. Odd, he thought, there didn't seem to be anyone around the place. But those warm spring days, folks usually found the old man shambling around the building, his yard filled with chickens, an old milk cow grazing on a patch of grass, and the mule rubbing his back against the rotting split iron fence. And right in the middle of it all would be Jacob Cox, singing some ancient tune at the top of his lungs to the bored livestock. Winding peered through the gathering dusk at the deserted homestead. All Cox's animals are gone. In fact, there was no sound at all, save for the cricket chorus along the trail. Only 2 weeks prior, before Winding had set out on his trip to the southern part of the state, he had spent several minutes in idle conversation with Jacob Cox. Now, there wasn't a trace of the old man or his holdings. Winding nudged his horse. Quite unexpectedly, Cox walked out of the barn and crossed the road a few yards in front of the horseman. Winding yelled out. Cox kept on moving toward a corn crib filled with the residue of winter feed. Oh well, Martin reasoned. The old fellow was getting on in his years, and his hearing was not all what it should be. As Winding rode by, he peered off toward the direction in which Cox had walked. A sudden gust of wind tickled his neck, and the next instant Winding was nearly thrown from his saddle as a pair of hands suddenly and forcefully grabbed his shoulders. Winding's horse sprang forward, but the faster it galloped, the tighter the hands came on Winding's shoulders. He hung on as best he could, flipping in the saddle like a sewing machine bobbin gone wild. But not once did he dare to look to see who or what had joined him for a ride. Within a few minutes, Winding's horse came to a stream at the edge of the Cox farm, and the hands on the rider's shoulders relaxed their grip. Winding risked a glance backward. All he could see was the grimly roadway that stretched towards the log cabins of old Jacob Cox's farm. Nary a word had passed between him and his mysterious passenger, only the vice-like grip around his shoulders, and something terribly cold pressed against him. The following morning, Martin Winding relayed his strange tale to a friend in town. After a long pause, the man nodded his head. Yes, he allowed at length, your story just might be true. Another fellow claimed to have had the same experience not more than 3 days before. Winding's hand speculated that the fellow who jumped on the horse was probably old Jacob Cox himself. Winding laughed at the idea. There just wasn't any way that Jacob Cox could jump on a moving horse Why, he could barely climb onto a wagon. Yes, there was, the friend replied. If it wasn't Jacob Cox in the flesh who was doing the jumping, old Jacob died 10 days before, and your weird riding companion was probably the ghost of Jacob Cox. With that, Martin Winding gulped down the rest of his beer and headed toward the door. He was never quite the same again. Alright, we'll start the next one. The Vigil. Dolores Hart opened her eyes and tried to focus on the unfamiliar surroundings. What was this place? The bed was very large, much bigger than the one at home. The sheets were pulled tight, a little blanket draped over the top. She couldn't move very well, but both her legs and arms felt as if they were held down by rocks. Something white was around them. She couldn't move her head, and it hurt very much. The child's eyes shifted slowly about the room, noticing the window with the curtain and shade closed, a door going somewhere, and 2 simple chairs. Dolores knew this was not her home. But where was she then? She couldn't remember exactly what happened, only that she had been in the car with her grandpa and great-grandpa. But it was something big, she sensed that much. Dolores then saw the nice-looking lady was standing at the foot of her bed. The young girl tried to speak, but the woman raised her hand to her lips. There was something peculiar about her, Dolores thought. She looked a lot like one of the pretty ladies out of her storybooks. A kind of haze shimmered around her, and she didn't move. But she had such a nice smile that Dolores wasn't a bit afraid. She felt very warm and comfortable in the nice lady's presence. Dolores drifted in and out of consciousness over the next few days. Men and women in white coats often came into the room, but apparently they didn't see the nice lady who never moved or spoke. Dolores tried to ask the man who looked into her eyes and throat where her mom and papa were, but somehow she couldn't make the sound right. Herbert and Rose Hart, Dolores' parents, were not allowed into their daughter's room for the first few days after the accident. Her condition was too critical. Dolores was not expected to live. On that early 1932 afternoon, another automobile had swerved across the center lane into the pass of her grandfather's car. Now, her grandfather was lying close to death in another Terre Haute hospital room. Her great-grandfather had been killed instantly. Dolores nearly had her scalp split off by flying glass. She sustained several additional serious injuries. Miraculously, Dolores Hart recovered. The doctors actually termed her recovery a miracle. Her parents were thankful that their prayers had been answered. Yet the young child didn't understand or recall everything that had happened, only that the kind lady was always in her room. The other people who silently entered her room always walked around the lady. That was silly, Dolores thought. Why didn't they say hello? Couldn't they see her? The small lady with jet black hair, deep brown eyes, and light complexion never touched Dolores. Later, after Dolores had told her parents about the nice lady, hospital doctors and nurses stating emphatically that no one that description worked at Terre Haute Hospital nor had been allowed into the girl's room. Who then was the visitor who kept vigil over Dolores? Following Dolores' release from the hospital, her father became obsessed with discovering the identity of the woman in the hospital. He later found some old photographs tucked away in the trunk and showed them to Dolores. Dolores' eyes shone. "That was the nice lady," she said. It was she who had been with her in the hospital. "That was impossible," her father replied. "It simply couldn't be." "Yes," the child insisted. "That was the lady who made me want to live." Dolores' father could only shake his head in disbelief. The photograph was one of her mother, Belle Hart, who had been dead for 20 years. Oh, one of his mother, my bad, sorry. No wonder I was like, that isn't math. Sorry. Anyway, on to the next story. Oscar. The kids in Oscar's Evansville neighborhood knew him as a friendly, outgoing 19-year-old who took delight in giving them rides in a shiny new car. Civic, 1922. They would pile in, eager to careen over the dusty roads around the city. Late in the evening, Oscar would bring them back to his house and call goodnight. They would scatter to their own respective dwellings. The routine didn't vary on that one evening in the early 1920s when everyone waved at Oscar, went into his house. They never saw him again. His parents found him dead in his bed the next morning. The cause of death is not known. Oscar's ghost may linger still in Evansville, attached now to a family that moved into Oscar's old home years after his death. At least that's what Warren and Gladys Richards think. They have been the targets of Oscar's friendly antics for over 40 years. If that is indeed the explanation, all the strange occurrences of Richards have witnessed. The house where Oscar lived and died, where the Richards first met his spirit, is gone now. The lot is occupied by part of the Doctor's Plaza, a medical clinic. But back in 1942, Gladys and Warren Reynolds, a young married couple, lived there. At first I thought they were ordinary noises. Soft-spoken Gladys Reynolds. My gosh, I can't read. Reynolds remembered. But my husband thought from the beginning that something peculiar was going on. He always seemed to have the most experience. I worked during the days, and he was on the night shift as a deputy sheriff. Oscar seemed to be around more during the day when my husband was at home. Richards first indicated that Oscar was still in his house came during a thunderstorm. The family was in a downstairs room. Footsteps suddenly pounded across an upstairs hallway. What followed seemed like windows being shut in the bedrooms. Sure enough, when the family checked upstairs, each window that had been open was now firmly closed against the brooding storm. On another day, the couple's 24-year-old daughter was home alone finishing some homework. In the dining room, she heard someone coming down the staircase. The little girl was so frightened. Oh my gosh, 12. I cannot read. She's 12. was frightened, so she hid under the big table. The descending footsteps stopped abruptly on the last step. Peering out, the child could see she was quite alone. Oscar was very shy. On only 2 occasions did he allow himself to be glimpsed. The witness in both cases was Warren Reynolds' mother. She lived with her son and daughter-in-law for several years before her death. The senior Miss Reynolds, I keep calling her Richards, I don't know, Reynolds, occupied the same bedroom in which Oscar was reputed to have died. The first time she saw Oscar was quite late at night, when a sharp sound forced her awake. She looked around the room. There was Oscar standing back to her, with his back to her, bending over a grate in the fireplace. Hoping the specter would disappear, the old woman pulled the blanket over her head. A few moments later, she peeked out. The shadowy stranger was still there. Oscar finally melted into the darkness. Oscar's second visit to his old room was a bit shorter, and again at night. He was standing quite still next to the potted plant, with his back towards Mrs. Reynolds, who had again been awoken from a sound sleep. And as before, after a few seconds, he seemed to melt away. Oscar frequented his bedroom often. He seemed to prefer the can-bottomed rocker, for the family would hear its familiar creaking back and forth for minutes on end. Each time they investigated, however, the chair was absolutely still and no one was in the room. Gladys Reynolds recalled that Oscar also liked to prowl about the partially finished attic. My husband heard someone up there one afternoon. He thought some kids had broken in through the window. Well, since he was a deputy sheriff, he took out his revolver and headed up the stairs. But when he got there, he couldn't find anything. All the windows were locked, and nothing had been disturbed. From what he heard, he was convinced someone had been walking around up there. The incident in 1948 involved a woman friend of Miss Reynolds, who came to visit for several days. Later the first evening, after her friend had retired, Mrs. Reynolds heard drawers opening and closing upstairs, footsteps coming across the floorboards, and doors slamming. Surprised by the activity, she thought perhaps her friend was preparing to leave early in the morning. That notion was dispelled at breakfast when her friend assured her she was indeed staying and had slept soundly through the night. She emphatically decided before the source, or denied being the source of the nocturnal activity. The Reynolds family moved out of Oscar's house in 1965. It was subsequently turned down to make way for the medical facility. Oscar, however, may have been so taken with the Reynolds family that he moved with them into the next house. Sometimes they heard faint footsteps or the creaking of the rocking chair Oscar fancied. In the new house, Gladys Reynolds says there had been 2 occasions when the objects had mysteriously disappeared, only to be found later in places the family thought thoroughly searched. When I couldn't find a makeup compact in its usual drawer, Gladys Reynolds said, I thought my granddaughter had taken it to play with. I didn't want to say anything to my daughter. I didn't want her to spank the child. I looked everywhere, and after a few days, I just gave up. My daughter and her family left, and I still couldn't find the compact. Well, one day I opened a cabinet, and there it was right in front of my eyes. I had looked there, and must certainly have seen it if it had been there earlier. Mrs. Reynolds attributes such incidences to pranks pulled by Oscar. After 40 years of his antics, the Reynolds treat him like one of the family. They didn't fear him, and indeed respond to his now infrequent visits with a matter-of-factness characteristic of people who have accepted what is sometimes so hard for others to believe. I never did believe in ghosts either, Mrs. Reynolds emphasized with a laugh. But I know what I heard, what my husband believes, and what my mother-in-law saw. I can't explain it, but all these things did happen. Do they want Oscar to reveal his presence more often? Miss Reynolds thinks probably not. We always have the feeling Oscar's in the house, she affirms, and that seems to be enough for the Reynolds family and their old friend. Alright, that is the end for that. Thank you for listening. Sorry for the not reading ability. And please come back for more.